rise in anti-femicide policy in Latin America. More specifically, I will be examining what explains the increase in the actual efficacy of those policies in the region. The greater puzzle that this touches upon is what explains a rise in effective policy protecting women. This is particularly puzzling within this region, as it is a male-dominated society with mostly male-dominated governments. Additionally, the presence of machismo within Latin American culture adds an ideological aspect of subjugation of women. The cases I will look into are Mexico and Peru. Here you can see a timeline of when the policies related to femicide were enacted, as well as the Juarez murders, which was the mass act of femicide against 30 women in the Mexican city of Juarez. It acted as a catalyst in a lot of the discussion of femicide, as well as the efficacy of the policy itself. Here you can see the two countries on a map, and this is how I will operationalize my dependent variable. I will examine second generation versus first generation policy, second generation being a greater degree of acknowledgement of the robust nature of gender-based violence, with first generation policy generally only accounting for the singular definition of femicide, which is the misogynistic killing of women. Going into my scholarly literature, my first school of thought relates to political representation and how the efficacy of policies protecting women changes with a greater degree of political representation. The IRI examined 29 African countries and hypothesized that a higher number of political representation of women in parliament will not only change the quantity of the policy, but the nature of the policy itself. And Claire Branzett, as well as other scholars, hypothesized that governments with a greater degree of political representation of women are more likely to pass laws that effectively protect the women of those countries. And the variables used within these articles are seen below. For the sake of time, I will not read them. Transnational advocacy networks relates to my puzzle with a shift in the socioeconomic formation of policy and seeing how the work done by transnational advocacy networks results in higher quality policies. Valerie Spearling looks into feminist activism within Russia and the United States and hypothesizes that these networks do not work in a unidirectional way, but rather this policy change or change in discourse happens at the intersection of feminist discourse, that's, again, specifically within Russia and the United States. Keck and Sikink hypothesize that the blurring boundaries between a state's relation with its own nationals and the recourse between citizens and states have to the international system. So how are international entities relating to domestic policymaking? And they hypothesize that these advocacy networks are helping to transform the national practice of sovereignty. So relating to my puzzle, this has to do, again, with international institutions playing a role in policymaking. My final school of thought is the use of media. Within this case, media is journalism, televised news, and social media. And it, with regard to my research puzzle, it looks into how media offers women a voice in this discussion and how that increases the efficacy of policy. The European Parliament discusses how media allows for an unavoidable knowledge of the female experience and how this creates more effective policy. Estelle Lucio and Kyoko Nuwaka hypothesize that this unprecedented use of social media and technology by women results in a greater degree of efficacy as the female experience is more accounted for. From my review of scholarly literature, I've developed a more robust lens through which I will examine what explains the rise in anti-femicide policy, and going further than that, the greater degree of efficacy. And I've used various IVs for my scholarly research, such as political stability, representation of women, and methods of operationalization. Moving into my methodology, I selected Mexico and Peru, as I stated previously. Within these two cases, there's case variation in the dependent variable that allows for an exploration of the antecedent conditions under which this lack of covariation could occur, with Mexico having second-generation policy and Peru having first-generation policy. I've accounted for selection bias in having variance in my DV, and I will be using the building block research objective. Having examined pre-existing theories, I used Mexico and Peru to build off of this in order to further develop an answer to my research question. The variables I will be exploring, as I mentioned, my dependent variable is efficacy of anti-femicide policy, and my independent variables are political stability, political representation of women, international pressure regarding women's rights, prevalence of violence against women, and the inclusion of women in media, and the values for these variables will be provided later. My hypotheses, firstly, I will examine how media documentation of femicide in Latin America results in international pressure because of an increased amount of global knowledge, and how this results in a greater degree of efficacy. Secondly, I will look into media documenting femicide in Latin America and how that allows for policymakers to more adequately reflect and protect the female experience, with, again, resulting in a greater degree of efficacy. And then finally, I will look into how political stability allows for policymakers to devote an increased focus to social issues such as women's rights, and how that results in a greater degree of efficacy. With respect to my data collection, I will predominantly be using document research, interviews, and personal accounts. These offer a first-hand look into the current state within my cases, though they do hold potential for criticism based on individual biases. And I will also be using surveys and statistical evidence, though sparingly, as evidence related to gender-based violence is incredibly biased. My congruence, I will be using congruence procedure type 2, as Mexico and Peru have a lack of covariation in their DV. This again allows for an examination of how this lack of covariation occurs. Additionally, I chose this method because of the socioeconomic constants within the two cases. In regard to validity and reliability, as I mentioned, I controlled for selection bias by having variance in my DV, and I controlled for bias in my sources by choosing sources that do not hold a great degree of bias. So now I will go through my variables. Political stability within Peru has maintained historically and presently a great degree of instability, again, historically being 1990, where my time frame begins. Mexico was experiencing a degree of instability, however, it's moving towards stability. The political representation of women within Peru was originally limited, but encouraged by their previous leader, Fujimori. Now it has a 30% quota for female participation in each political party, though this is still limited. Historically, Mexican participation of female citizens in government was pretty much limited to NGOs and activism, but it has a predominantly female Senate now and one of the highest representations of women in government. International pressure on Peru, historically and presently, has not changed very much as they react with contention each time, Peru has experienced multiple charges against its high-ranking political and military officials. And Mexico historically has experienced international pressure, such as the 1914 Convention related to women's rights, where Mexico was found guilty of human rights violations because of the Juarez murders. Presently, though, Mexico works with international institutions to work towards the protection of its women. Prevalence of gender-based violence in both of these countries has been very extreme and unchanging. And the inclusion of women in media is historically within Peru. Voices of women have traditionally been limited with respect to the public sphere, and even now, a journalist states, women have numerical superiority in the newsroom, but they do not call the shots. Within Mexico, journalists have taken on, for example, machismo, which is an example of women's voices in media being used to shift ideology present in Latin America. And both countries have experienced Ni Una Menos, movement within Latin America fighting violence against women. I will now look into my specific hypotheses. Firstly, using the values I previously stated, I will examine my first hypothesis. Given the media representation of women in Peru and Mexico and the lack of covariation, and then again, a lack of covariation in the international pressure on Peru and Mexico, there is a lack of covariation in the efficacy of the policy. And then again, with a lack of covariation in women's voices in Peru and Mexico, there's a lack of covariation in the policy itself. And then, again, Peru and Mexico experience different levels of stability, though both experiencing instability in the past. And they produce different levels of efficacy in their policy. In conclusion, political stability, representation of women in government, international pressure, the prevalence of gender-based violence, and the inclusion of women in media all allow for a greater degree of efficacy in the policy implemented. However, my research indicates that political stability is especially influential as it undermines the ability to effectively protect women through policy. I've also noted an issue with my dependent variable that the policy itself counts for the multifaceted nature of gender-based violence, but it's really difficult to determine how this is actually influencing the reality faced by women within these countries, again, because of the biased nature of the reports of gender-based violence. Connecting this conclusion to theory, my research corroborates existing theory, but it goes further to acknowledge the multiplicity of the antecedent conditions necessary for effective anti-femicide policy. In regard to future research, I believe my research provides the opportunity to look into which media outlets are most effective in changing policy, along with what specific factors within the policies themselves are most effective compared to others, though this would be at a later time when the data is available. Thank you for your time.